The gymnasium smelled like floor wax and cut flowers, and somewhere behind me, my mother-in-law was already telling the family sitting next to us how much this day had cost. My name is Renee and I'm 36. I've been married to my husband Adam for 11 years, and that morning I was sitting in a folding chair in a packed high school gymnasium, watching my son Ethan's graduating class file in under fluorescent lights, his name printed in the program in a font too small for how big this moment felt. Ethan was 18. I worked as a pediatric nurse 3 12-hour shifts a week, which meant I'd spent more hours of his childhood at his bedside during fevers and stitches than I had at school plays, a fact that had quietly shaped more of our family dynamics than anyone liked to admit out loud. Beside me, Adam's mother, Diane, sat in a cardigan despite the warmth of the room, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she'd produced before the ceremony had even started, already glowing with the particular pride of a woman who considered this day, in some essential way, hers. "For years of tuition," she said to the couple beside her, not quietly, in the tone of someone repeating a fact she'd said many times before and never tired of. "Private school the whole way through. We paid for everything." I felt my spine go a little straighter in my chair, the way it always did when Diane said things like that. Not loud enough to argue with, not quiet enough to ignore. Down in the second row, sitting between his father and his grandfather, my younger son Caleb, 9 years old in his good shirt, swinging his legs because his feet didn't quite reach the floor, turned around in his seat. He'd heard her. Of course he'd heard her. Caleb heard everything, especially things he wasn't supposed to. And in about 30 seconds, in front of half the people I'd spent 11 years trying to keep peace with, my 9-year-old was going to say one sentence that would make all of them go quiet, and would finally make me say something I'd been swallowing for over a decade. I had no idea, sitting there in that folding chair with the smell of floor wax in my nose, that today, Ethan's graduation of all days, was the day everything I'd been quietly absorbing for 11 years was finally going to come apart in public, and that it would take a 9-year-old to do it. To understand why Diane's comment landed the way it did, you have to understand what our family actually looked like. Not the version Diane described at dinner parties, but the real one, the one made of receipts and late nights and small math nobody talked about. Adam and I had married young. I was 25, he was 27, and Ethan had come along less than 2 years later, a surprise that arrived in the middle of Adam finishing his MBA. Those early years were tight in a way that's hard to explain to people who haven't lived it. Counting out quarters for laundry, choosing between the electric bill and groceries some months, both of us working while taking turns with night classes and night shifts. Diane and her husband, Frank, had money. Not extravagant money, but comfortable, stable, the kind that comes from decades of careful saving and a paid-off house. And over the years they'd helped. A few $1,000s here toward a car repair. Help with a security deposit when we moved for Adam's job. A check every Christmas, that always arrived with a card and a comment about how every little bit helps when you're starting out. I was grateful for it. I want to be clear about that because it matters for everything that comes after. I was genuinely grateful in a way that, looking back, I think Diane had come to depend on. Gratitude, in our family, had a way of becoming currency. Every contribution, no matter how small, got cashed in later, not for anything specific, just for a kind of permanent leverage, a story that could be told and retold about how much had been given, and how little, by implication, had been given back. What never got mentioned, not by Diane, not really by anyone including me for years, was everything on the other side of the ledger. The years I'd worked double shifts so Adam could finish his degree debt-free. The years I'd covered our mortgage almost entirely on my income, while Adam built his consulting business from nothing. The fact that Ethan's private school the whole way through had actually started in 3rd grade, after 2 years of public school that nobody mentioned, paid for by a combination of Adam's income, my overtime, and for the first 2 years of private tuition before Diane and Frank started contributing, a small inheritance from my own grandmother, the only money I'd ever inherited in my life, which I'd put toward my son's education without a second thought and without ever once bringing it up. Afterward, I never corrected the story, I think now. Not because it was true, but because correcting it felt like keeping score. And keeping score felt like the kind of thing that would make me the difficult daughter-in-law, the ungrateful one. So I let the story stand year after year, and it grew a little each time it was told, the way stories do when nobody's there to push back. By the time Ethan was in high school, Diane and Frank's actual contribution to his tuition had grown to about 1/3 of the total cost. Generous, genuinely generous, and something I'd thanked them for sincerely more than once. But somewhere in the retelling, 1/3 had become Everything. And nobody, including me, had ever said otherwise. The years leading up to that graduation were, on the surface, unremarkable, the kind of years that make up most of a marriage, full of small routines nobody thinks to examine until something forces you to look at them all at once. Sunday dinners at Diane and Frank's house were a fixture, had been since before Caleb was born. I liked Frank, genuinely. He was quiet, kind in an understated way, the sort of grandfather who'd sit on the floor with Caleb for an hour building Lego sets without ever once checking his phone. Diane was different. Diane was warm in big visible ways, the kind of warmth that needed an audience, and underneath that warmth was something I'd learned to navigate the way you navigate a familiar staircase in the dark, carefully by memory, trying not to think too hard about the parts that didn't quite line up. There was a pattern to Diane's comments about money. I noticed it more as the years went on, though noticed isn't quite the right word because I think I'd always noticed it. What changed was how much it started to bother me. "We're so lucky we could help with Ethan's school," she'd say at dinner in front of Adam's cousins. "Education is the best gift you can give a child." Frank and I always said, "Whatever it takes." Whatever it takes. I'd sit there, passing the potatoes, and feel something tighten behind my ribs. Not anger, not yet, just a kind of low hum of discomfort, the sense of a story being told about my life that I hadn't agreed to. Adam noticed it too sometimes, or at least I think he did. Once, after a dinner where Diane had spent 20 minutes telling a story about Ethan's wonderful school, that somehow became, by the end, a story about Diane and Frank's generosity, Adam said, in the car on the way home. "She does that a lot, huh?" "Does what?" I asked, even though I knew exactly what he meant. "Makes it sound like, I don't know. Like it was all them." He glanced at me. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said. And I was mostly, or I'd convinced myself I was, which at the time felt like the same thing. That conversation in the car is one I think about a lot now, I realize. Not because of what was said, but because of what almost happened and didn't. Adam saw it. He named it, even in his own quiet way. And I closed the door on it immediately, not because I didn't want him to see it, but because some part of me was afraid that if we actually talked about it, really talked about it, I'd have to admit how much it had been bothering me for years. And admitting that felt like it would change something I wasn't ready to change. So I said I'm fine, and we drove home, and the next Sunday we went back to dinner. And Diane told another version of the same story, and I passed the potatoes again. The first real crack, the first time I said anything out loud, came about a year before the graduation during a conversation that, on its own, seemed almost too small to matter. Caleb had started 3rd grade that fall, and Diane had asked, during a Sunday dinner, whether we'd be sending him to the same private school Ethan attended. "We'd love to help again, of course," she said, in the same warm, generous tone she always used. "Education's so important. We've always believed that." "That's really kind," I said. "We're actually looking at a few options. The tuition's gone up quite a bit since Ethan started, and with 2 kids now, the math is a little different." "Well, you know us," Diane said, smiling. "We paid for everything for Ethan. We'd want to do the same for Caleb, obviously." And there it was, that phrase, everything, said so easily, so warmly, in front of Frank, in front of Adam, in front of my own 2 sons, who were old enough by then to understand what words meant. I felt something shift in my chest, not a big shift, not dramatic. Just a small, clear thought, arriving the way thoughts sometimes do when you've been carrying something heavy for so long you've stopped noticing the weight, and then suddenly, for just a second, you do. I almost said something that night, I think now. I had the sentence ready, something simple, something like, "Actually, we covered a good portion of that ourselves, especially early on." Just a correction. Not even an accusation. Just a fact, the kind of fact you'd think could exist alongside everything Diane had genuinely contributed, without taking anything away from it. I didn't say it. I smiled and said something about how generous they'd been, and the conversation moved on to something else, and Caleb, 6 years old at the time, went back to pushing peas around his plate, not paying attention, or so I thought. That was the first time I really understood something about myself, I think now. It wasn't that I couldn't speak up. I'd spoken up about plenty of things in my life, at work, with friends, even with Adam, about things that mattered far less than this. It was that speaking up about this specifically felt like it would cost something I wasn't willing to pay. The version of myself that Diane had always seen as easy, agreeable, grateful. I built 11 years on being that version. And some part of me, even then, understood that correcting the story even once would mean I couldn't go back to not correcting it. So I didn't. And the months went on, and Caleb started at the same private school, Tuition covered again by a combination none of us ever broke down out loud, though I knew because I did the family's finances exactly how the math actually worked. Diane and Frank's contribution mattered. It was real and meaningful, and I was thankful for it every single time the tuition bill came due. It just wasn't everything. And by then, everything had become the only word anyone ever used. Looking back, I don't think suspicion is quite the right word for what started building that year. There was no secret to uncover, no hidden behavior in the way these stories usually go. What was building slowly was something closer to a private inventory, a quiet accounting in my own head of every time the story got told and I let it stand. It happened at Ethan's junior year parent-teacher conferences, when Diane came along, something she'd started doing, framed as wanting to stay involved, and introduced herself to Ethan's guidance counselor as the one who's been making this education possible. It happened at Thanksgiving when Frank's brother visited from out of state, and Diane, retelling the story for an audience that hadn't heard it before, added a detail I'd never heard either, that they'd practically put him through school single-handedly, the way things were for you two back then. The way things were for you two back then. As if our early struggles had been a kind of helplessness Diane and Frank had rescued us from, rather than the ordinary difficulty of two people in their 20s building a life, a difficulty we'd worked our way through ourselves mostly, with their help arriving later, smaller and real, but not the whole story Diane had built around it. I started noticing something about myself during this time that I hadn't quite named before. I think now. Every time the story got bigger, I felt smaller, not because anything had actually been taken from me, but because the story was slowly erasing years of my own life. The double shifts, the night classes, my grandmother's inheritance, which I'd never told Diane about, not because it was a secret exactly, but because I'd never found a moment where mentioning it didn't feel like keeping score. I think that's the real reason I never corrected anything. It wasn't generosity, even though I told myself it was. It was that the inheritance, my grandmother's money, was the one part of this whole story that was entirely mine, untouched by anyone else's help or anyone else's narrative. And some quiet, irrational part of me had decided that if I brought it up just to win an argument about who paid for what, it would stop feeling like hers and start feeling like ammunition. I didn't want to spend it that way, so I didn't spend it at all. I just let it disappear into Diane's version of events, along with everything else. There was one moment about 6 months before the graduation that I think of now as the real turning point, though at the time it barely registered as anything at all. Ethan had been accepted to his first-choice college, a state university about 3 hours away, with a partial academic scholarship that covered roughly a quarter of the cost. We were at Sunday dinner when the acceptance letter came up, and Diane predictably beamed. "We'll cover whatever the scholarship doesn't," she said. "We always said we'd see him through all the way." "That's incredibly generous," Adam said, and I saw him glance at me. A brief glance, almost nothing, but I caught it. "Mom, you really don't have to." "We want to," Diane said, waving a hand. "We've always wanted to. We paid for his whole education up to now. It only makes sense to finish what we started." And there it was again. His whole education. Said in front of Ethan, who was 17, sitting at that table hearing, for what must have been the 100th time, a version of his own life that didn't quite include his mother's grandmother, or his mother's overtime, or any of the quiet arithmetic that had actually gotten him there. I looked at Ethan. He was looking down at his plate, and for just a second, just a flicker, I thought I saw something cross his face. Not anger. Something quieter. Something like recognition. I didn't think much of it at the time. I think now. Looking back, that flicker was the first sign that someone else in that family had started keeping the same private inventory I had. And that I wasn't the only one who'd noticed the gap between the story and the truth. I want to be honest about something. I never set out to gather proof of anything. There was no investigation, no folder of receipts I was quietly compiling for a future confrontation. What actually happened in the months leading up to the graduation was smaller and stranger than that. A series of moments where the gap between Diane's story and reality simply became too wide to keep stepping around. The first moment came from Ethan himself about 2 months before graduation. We were in the kitchen, just the two of us, which had become rare as he'd gotten older, busier, more absorbed in the particular self-contained world of senior year. He was filling out paperwork for his college orientation, and at some point, almost without looking up, he said, "Mom, can I ask you something?" About like money stuff? Sure, I said carefully, setting down the dish towel. Did Grandma and Grandpa really pay for like all of my school? Like all of it the whole time? I felt my whole body go very still. Why do you ask? I don't know. It's just Grandma says that a lot. And I was doing this scholarship application thing for college and it asks about family financial contributions to past education and I didn't really know what to put. So I figured I'd ask you since you'd actually know. I remember standing there for a moment. Not sure what to say I think now. Not because I didn't know the answer. I knew the answer better than anyone. I hesitated because I realized for the first time that my silence hadn't just been about me. It had been quietly shaping how my own son understood his own life. They contributed a lot, I said carefully. Especially the last few years. But it wasn't all of it. Your dad and I covered a good portion too, especially early on. There was also some money from my grandmother, your great-grandma, that helped pay for your first couple years of private school. Ethan looked up at that. Wait, really? I didn't know that. It's not really a secret, I said. It just never really came up. He was quiet for a moment processing this. Huh, he said finally. Grandma always makes it sound like, I don't know, like it was all them. I always just figured that's how it was. That sentence, I always just figured that's how it was, is one I've thought about more than almost anything else in this whole story I think now. Because that's exactly what I'd figured too for 11 years. Not because it was true. Because nobody had ever told him otherwise, and nobody had ever told me otherwise either, not really. We'd both just absorbed the story because the story was the only version anyone ever said out loud. I didn't make a big thing of it. I told Ethan simply that families help each other in lots of different ways, and that what mattered was that he'd gotten where he needed to be, which was true and which I believed. But something had shifted quietly in that kitchen. For the first time, the story Diane told wasn't just something I carried alone. My son had started to notice the gap too. The second moment came about 3 weeks later, and it was smaller, almost invisible, except that I happened to be in the room. Diane had come over to help drop off some of Ethan's things at his future dorm, boxes that had been accumulating in the garage for weeks. And at some point while going through one of the boxes she found an old folder, one I recognized immediately. Report cards, school photos, a few certificates, the kind of thing every parent accumulates and never quite knows what to do with. Oh, look at this, Diane said, pulling out Ethan's third grade school photo, the year he'd started private school. Third grade. That was right when he started at Lakeside, wasn't it? I remember writing that first tuition check like it was yesterday. I was folding laundry nearby and I didn't say anything, old habit by then, almost automatic. But Caleb, who was 9 and had wandered into the room a few minutes earlier looking for snacks, had stopped and was listening in the particular still way kids have when they've decided something is worth paying attention to. Grandma, Caleb said. Didn't Mom pay for some of that too? With the money from her grandma. Diane laughed. A light laugh, the kind that's meant to brush something away. Oh, sweetie. I think you might be a little confused. Grandpa and I have always taken care of school for you boys. No, but Ethan told me, Caleb said, with the flat, matter-of-fact confidence of a 9-year-old who believes he's simply providing useful information. He said Mom's grandma helped pay for the beginning part. And Mom told him that too. There was a small pause, the kind that, in the moment, felt like nothing, just a brief gap in conversation, the kind that happens a dozen times a day in any house with kids in it. Well, Diane said, still smiling, folding the photo back into the folder. I'm sure there's been all sorts of help from all sorts of places. It takes a village, doesn't it? She moved on to the next box. Caleb, satisfied, wandered off in search of his snack. And I stood there, folding the same shirt I'd already folded twice, feeling something I hadn't expected. Not vindication, not yet. Just a strange, quiet awareness that the story, for the first time in 11 years, had been interrupted. Not corrected, not really. Just interrupted by a 9-year-old who didn't know he was doing anything at all. I didn't say anything that day either, I think now. But something had changed. I think somewhere in that moment I understood that the story Diane told wasn't just mine to manage anymore. It had spread, quietly the way these things do, through the kids, through small conversations I hadn't been part of. And it had started to become something that wasn't entirely under either of our control. I should have known, looking back, that the next time it came up it wouldn't just be me in the room. The morning of Ethan's graduation everything felt, For a little while, almost perfect. We arrived early, found seats together near the front, Adam and me, Caleb between us, Diane and Frank on my other side. The whole extended family arranged in that particular configuration families fall into without anyone deciding it. The gymnasium filled slowly. The noise building, parents craning their necks for a glimpse of caps and gowns lining up in the hallway outside. Diane was in good spirits, genuinely warmly happy, the way she often was at moments like this, and I want to be fair about that. Whatever else was true about Diane, her pride in Ethan that morning was real. She'd brought a small gift bag, tucked under her chair, and she kept glancing toward the hallway every few minutes, looking for him. It was during one of those quiet stretches, the gap between the band finishing its warm-up and the ceremony officially beginning, that she turned to the couple sitting on her other side, parents of one of Ethan's classmates she'd apparently met before, and started talking. "Can you believe it's already here?" she said. "4 years goes by so fast. Private school the whole way through. Frank and I always said education is the best investment you can make. We paid for everything." It was the same sentence. The exact same sentence, almost word for word, that I'd heard 100 times before in 100 slightly different rooms. I felt the familiar tightening start in my chest, and then beside me, I felt Caleb shift in his seat. He turned around, not dramatically, just the way a 9-year-old turns around when something's been said that he has an opinion about, and looked at Diane and said in the clear, carrying voice that 9-year-olds use without any awareness that a voice can carry, "That's not totally true though. Mom paid for some of it too. With money from her grandma. Ethan told me." The gymnasium didn't go silent. There were hundreds of people, a band warming up somewhere, the low roar of 1,000 quiet conversations, but in the small radius around us something definitely shifted. The couple beside Diane glanced over, politely curious. Diane's smile, for just a fraction of a second, froze in place. "Oh, sweetheart, I think there's been some confusion," Diane started, the same line she'd used before, the brush-away tone. "There's not, though," Caleb said with the calm, slightly puzzled certainty of a child who genuinely doesn't understand why an adult is disagreeing with a fact. "Mom literally told Ethan. I was there. She said her grandma helped pay for the beginning part, and you and Grandpa helped with the rest. That's why it's not everything. It's like, most of it but not everything." I want to describe what that moment felt like because it's still vivid to me, clearer honestly than almost anything else from that whole day I think now. It wasn't shame and it wasn't triumph either, even though some part of me had imagined, over the years in private angry moments, what it might feel like if the truth ever came out in front of people. What it actually felt like was something much simpler, relief. The kind of relief you feel when a weight you've been holding for so long that your arms have gone numb is suddenly gently taken from you, not by force, but because someone smaller and lighter than you just picked it up without realizing how heavy it was. Diane's face had gone a careful, composed kind of pale, the look of someone recalculating in real time how many people had just heard something she'd said 100 times without ever expecting it to be checked. "Caleb," Adam said gently, leaning over. "Buddy, maybe we can talk about this later, okay? The ceremony's about to start." "Okay," Caleb said easily, already turning back around, completely unbothered. The way kids are when they've said something true and don't understand yet that truth can land differently depending on who's in the room. The couple beside Diane offered a small, awkward smile and turned back toward the stage. Diane sat very still for a moment, the gift bag at her feet, her hands folded in her lap. And then, and this is the part one think about most, she reached over without a word and took my hand. Just briefly. Just for a second. And didn't say anything at all. I don't think I'd ever seen Diane go quiet like that. I think now. 11 years. And I'd never once seen her not have something to say. And in that silence, that small strange silence in a gymnasium full of strangers, with the band tuning up and my younger son already moving on to ask Adam if he could see the program, I think I finally understood something I hadn't let myself understand before. Diane's story had never really been about money. It had been about being needed. About being the person whose help mattered most. And for one unguarded second, sitting there with my hand in hers, I think she realized, not that she'd been wrong exactly, but that the story she'd told for so long had quietly, slowly, made someone else smaller. And she hadn't meant to. But it had happened anyway. The ceremony started a few minutes later. Ethan's name was called somewhere in the long alphabetical procession, and we all stood and clapped, and for those few minutes none of it mattered. Not the story, not the correction, none of it. Just my son in a cap and gown crossing a stage, 18 years old and entirely, completely his own. We didn't talk about it that day, not really. There was a lunch afterward, photos, the particular happy chaos of a graduation celebration, and Diane was warm and present throughout, if a little quieter than usual. Nobody brought up what Caleb had said. It simply existed now, in the space between us, the way true things do once they've been said out loud. Not loudly acknowledged, but no longer deniable either. It was about a week later that Diane called me, just me, which was unusual. Diane usually called the house line or texted the family group chat. I almost didn't recognize her voice at first. It was quieter than I was used to, less performed. "I wanted to call you," she said. "About Caleb." "About what he said?" "Diane, it's really okay." "No, let me." She paused. "I've been thinking about it all week. And I realized I don't actually remember the last time I asked you how things were paid for. Not really asked. I think I just decided a long time ago what the story was, and then I just kept telling it. And nobody ever told me it wasn't quite right. Including you." Another pause. "I think that's on me. Not on you for not saying anything. On me, for never asking in a way that would have let you." I sat with that for a moment, longer than the silence on the phone probably warranted, I think now. Because it was the first time in 11 years that anyone in that family had framed the silence as something other than my choice, had recognized that the absence of correction isn't the same thing as agreement, and that sometimes the people closest to a story are the last ones who feel allowed to tell it differently. "We're really grateful for everything you and Frank did do," I said. "That part was always true. I think I let the story get bigger than it was because correcting it felt like it would take something away from you. And I didn't want to do that." "I know," Diane said. "I think I knew that too, actually. I think that's part of why I never asked." She let out a small breath. Not quite a laugh, but close. "Your grandmother's money. For Ethan's school. I never even knew about that." "She left it to me when I was 26, I said. "It wasn't a huge amount. But it covered most of his first 2 years, before you and Frank started helping." "I wish I'd known that," Diane said. "I would have liked to know that. About her, I mean. Not for any other reason. I just think it's a nice thing to know about someone." We talked for a little while longer, about small things, mostly the kind of small things that feel different after a conversation like that, lighter somehow. Before we hung up, Diane said one more thing, almost as an afterthought. "Tell Caleb I'm not mad. Whatever he might be thinking. He was just telling the truth. I should probably be a little more grateful that someone in this family is still willing to do that." I think about that phone call often, I think now. Not because it fixed everything, it didn't, not in any dramatic way. Diane still tells stories the way Diane tells stories. Some habits, especially ones built over decades, don't disappear because of one conversation. But something did change. The story got smaller after that, not erased, just sized correctly. We helped with a lot of it instead of we paid for everything. A small adjustment. The kind most people wouldn't even notice. But I noticed. Every time. A few months later at a family dinner, Diane brought up Ethan's college tuition again. The partial scholarship, the contribution she and Frank were making toward the rest. And this time, almost casually, she added, "And of course you two have always done so much too, way more than people probably realize." It wasn't a grand gesture. Nobody applauded. Caleb, busy with his food, didn't even seem to notice. But I noticed. And for the first time in 11 years, I didn't feel that small tightening in my chest at all. What I understand now, looking back, is that I spent over a decade protecting a story that was never really mine to protect, and that the cost of protecting it wasn't just to me. It was quietly teaching my own children what their lives were worth, and to whom they owed it. I don't think Diane ever meant to do that. I don't think I ever meant to let it happen either. But meaning well isn't the same as seeing clearly, and sometimes it takes someone too young to know the rules to finally show everyone else what they'd been agreeing to without noticing. Ethan started college a few weeks later. 3 hours away, settled into a dorm room that still had some of those same boxes from the garage stacked in the corner. He calls most Sundays. Sometimes Diane is at our house when he calls and she always asks to talk to him, and they always end up laughing about something, and it's easy and warm in a way that feels finally like it doesn't need a story attached to explain it. The strange thing about this story is that nothing was ever stolen. Nothing was ever hidden in the way these family stories usually go. And yet something real was still taken slowly over more than a decade. Not money but credit. The quiet erosion of one person's contribution until it simply ceased to exist in the family's shared memory. What makes Diane such a recognizable figure isn't malice. It's the particular, ordinary vanity of people who measure their own worth by how indispensable they are to others. Diane's story about paying for everything wasn't a lie she told to deceive anyone. It was a story she told to feel necessary, and somewhere along the way she stopped being able to tell the difference between feeling necessary and actually being the whole reason something happened. The tragedy isn't that Diane was cruel. It's that she never had to be, because Renee's silence did all the work for her, year after year, without anyone ever asking her to. And Renee's silence deserves its own scrutiny, separate from anything Diane did. Renee wasn't a passive victim of a story being told about her. She was, in a very real sense, its co-author through 11 years of small omissions that each felt individually like the path of least resistance. What this story illustrates, more than anything, is how thoroughly a family narrative can be built not from grand deceptions, but from 1,000 moments where someone decided that correcting a small inaccuracy wasn't worth the discomfort, until the inaccuracy became the only version anyone's children had ever heard. The Junjung turning point of this story isn't the graduation scene at all, even though that's the moment everything becomes visible. The real turning point happens months earlier in that kitchen, when Ethan asks his mother a direct question and she finally answers it honestly, not to correct Diane, not as part of any larger plan, but simply because her son asked and she decided by then that he deserved the truth even if no one else ever would. That single honest answer is what made everything that followed possible. Without it, Caleb never would have had the information he repeated at the graduation. He would have absorbed the same incomplete story everyone else had, and the cycle would have continued for another generation. Which raises the quieter, more uncomfortable question underneath this whole story. How many family narratives are being passed down right now in ordinary households, simply because no one has ever been asked a direct question by someone too young to know not to ask it? How many contributions, financial, emotional, otherwise, have quietly disappeared from a family's collective memory, not through cruelty, but through the accumulated weight of everyone's reluctance to be the one who corrects the record? What Renee gained in the end wasn't a victory over Diane. There was no real confrontation, no reckoning in the dramatic sense. What she gained was something smaller and more durable. The ability to exist in her own family's story as someone who had actually done something, rather than someone who had simply been helped. That's a small thing. It's also, it turns out, almost everything. What strikes me most about this story is how unintentional all of it was. The years of silence, the slowly inflating narrative, even the correction itself, which came from a 9-year-old who had no idea he was doing anything significant at all. Maybe that's worth sitting with for a moment. How many of the things that shape us, the stories we believe about our own families, our own worth, our own place in the people we love, were never actually decided by anyone. They just accumulated, the way Diane's story accumulated, one small unchallenged moment at a time, until they hardened into something that felt like fact. And maybe the real lesson here isn't about gratitude or money, or even family specifically. It's smaller than that, and a little more uncomfortable. Sometimes the truth doesn't need a confrontation. It just needs someone in the room who hasn't yet learned that some things are supposed to go unsaid.